Hello. I hate writing intros, so let's keep this brief. Today I'll be talking about the Dark Souls Estus Flasks and healing systems. Let's see how balanced they are and how they progressed throughout the Dark Souls trilogy. The specific games I'll be using for this video are Dark Souls Remastered, Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, and Dark Souls 3. To keep things simple, I'll be referring to them as Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. I'll also be talking about balancing in reference to the healing systems. I'm going to be approaching this from a view encompassing both veterans and new players, because some of us might be able to navigate an area and kill the local boss without needing to use a single Estus. Others might try the area a dozen or more times before clearing the zone. I'll try to bridge the two with a middle-of-the-road, balanced view. With that preamble out of the way, let's get started. We shall begin with the first game in the Dark Souls trilogy. Now, the mechanics of the Estus Flask from the first Dark Souls is a bit more complicated than the other two, because unlike Dark Souls 2 and 3, the amount of Estus available in Dark Souls 1 is directly tied to how well you play the game. It's an interconnected balance between bonfires, humanities, and player skill. I've attempted to explain it as clearly as I can, so here we go. The player receives the Estus Flask after speaking with Oscar of Astora in the Undead Asylum. Upon receiving the flask, the player will gain access to 5 uses of the healing item. These uses are replenished each time a player rests at a bonfire. The player may freely use the Estus Flask without a time limit or a break between uses. Using the flask will fully stop the player and restrict them from taking any action until the animation is complete or interrupted by an enemy attack. This means players will have to carefully time when they use their Estus to avoid being hit mid-heal. Being hit in the middle of healing is often called heal punishing, as the player usually loses more health than they recovered, wasting an Estus and doing you no favors in the fight. The base amount of uses given by the Estus Flask is 5. The number of uses for the Estus can be increased. In Dark Souls 1, the number of uses is not tied to the upgrading of the flask itself, but rather the bonfires at which you refill it. The Estus is essentially just a vessel for whichever bonfire the player last rested at. So how does the player go about getting more uses from the bonfires? Players can locate items called humanities found throughout the world. These are semi-rare items with several uses for the player. The player can burn a humanity at a bonfire to kindle the bonfire. This will increase the Estus Flask restored by 5 uses per humanity burned. At the start of the game, the player is able to kindle any given bonfire once, improving the bonfire's flask regen from 5 to 10 Estus gained per rest. Once the player has ventured into the catacombs and slain Pinwheel, you will receive the Rite of Kindling. This item will allow players to kindle bonfires 2 more times. Kindle once for 10, twice for 15, and 3 times for 20 uses of the Estus Flask. Therefore, the upgrade of healing in Dark Souls 1 revolves around humanities. This affects gameplay in several ways. Firstly, it means the players will want to have as many humanities as possible. This way, they are able to kindle bonfires as they see fit. If a player is struggling in an area, they'll have the option to boost their Estus numbers. If a player is breezing through an area, they can preserve those humanities for a later time. This way, the expenditure of humanities is directly controlled by the player's ease or difficulty in any given area. Having as many humanities as possible also means not dying. As we know, a player drops all souls and humanities upon death. If you die again before retrieving your bloodstain, those humanities and souls are lost forever. And as we know, players can only kindle bonfires when human, meaning dying while human dictates you will need to use 1 extra humanity to first reverse hollowing before the player can kindle a bonfire. So death essentially scams you out of 1 humanity. If a player is struggling to get through the early areas, they might be kindling each bonfire. If they are kindling each bonfire and dying often, they will burn through their humanities in no time. This can incentivize players to play through the game hollow in order to preserve their humanities, only reversing hollowing in order to kindle a bonfire when necessary. This solution works very well, but playing hollow will also prevent a player from using summon signs for help with boss fights. So there is yet another incentive for players to improve at the game and play carefully to preserve their humanities. Secondly, it incentivizes the players to explore areas thoroughly. Humanities are located throughout the areas, often in obscure or challenging places. If players want to traverse the game with more healing items, they will need to search areas carefully, pushing players towards that lovely world exploration. Humanities can also be given to the player after killing a certain number of enemies without dying. By pushing through the levels, the player can randomly be rewarded with a bonus humanity, incentivizing players to keep pushing forward. Another way players can gain humanities is by slaying the bosses. Each boss is guaranteed to drop a humanity on death. There is a very good give and take here. If the player wants more healing items for an easier time, they'll have to keep pushing forward, combing areas for items and slaying bosses. As we can see, Dark Souls 1 is very interconnected. Estus Flasks are dependent on the level of the bonfires. The level of the bonfires is dependent on humanities. Humanities are dependent on exploration and not dying. Not dying is dependent on player skill and the Estus Flask. It's a great circle of gameplay mechanics that require a player to keep pushing forward and improving at the game. It creates a very well-balanced system where you're punished for mistakes and rewarded for playing carefully. Dark Souls 1 is the only game out of the trilogy where the availability of your primary healing item is intrinsically tied to how well you play the game. If the player goes down a spiral of dying, reversing hollow, kindling, and dying, they can completely run out of humanities. And some players might lose all of their humanities before kindling a single bonfire. In either case, they'll have a significantly harder time exploring the world and facing bosses. Once you have 10 Estus in Dark Souls 2 or 3, that number can never be reduced. Even if you're playing piss poor in a late game area, your number of flasks cannot be changed. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, if a player used all of their humanities and struggled to the next area, they might not have any left, meaning their mistakes have now affected how their journey through the next zone will go, to a greater degree than either of the two other games. This is where the design of Dark Souls 1's world comes into play. The first Dark Souls game is an interconnected Metroidvania. There are fewer open areas and large spaces for the player to explore. Having this smaller scale in its areas means enemy encounters are more carefully designed. Just from personal experience, I'd say you encounter about 3 to 4 times more enemies in Dark Souls 2 and 3, due to those games having larger, more populated areas for the player to traverse. Dark Souls 1 seems to have been crafted with the idea that a player has a limited amount of mistakes to make in any given area. Now this part is just my personal understanding of how this was crafted. To explain it further, let's look at the first area of the game, Undead Burge. The player can travel here immediately after finishing the tutorial. There is the initial stretch from Firelink to the lower Undead Burge bonfire. From here, the player will have to fight their way to the Tauros Demon boss fight. I'd say, on average, most players will want a minimum of 3 Estus Flasks available for the Tauros fight. This means the player is only allowed a maximum of 2 heals on their journey from the bonfire to the boss. Most new players will need to heal more than just 2 times to make this trip. Often what happens on your first playthrough is the slow, methodical battle through an area. Then the players arrive at the boss door with 1 to no Estus left. You can try a Hail Mary attempt at the boss, but most of the time this first attempt ends in defeat. Then begins the learning experience of dredging through the same area over and over. Each time the player is learning where the enemies in this area are and how to deal with them more effectively. Slowly but surely, players will improve until they are able to traverse the area without taking as much damage as before. Eventually, they'll understand the route well enough to arrive at the boss door with more Estus and finally beat the boss. If a player is struggling, making mistakes resulting in damage taken, they have the option of using a humanity to give themselves 5 more heals. So the player can make 5 more mistakes on their route while still arriving with a feasible supply of Estus. The risk of using humanity is, of course, what if the next area is even harder and I won't have this safety net of more heals when I need it later? And the answer to that is the classic Get Good. This is the incredibly well-crafted and balanced design of Dark Souls. Healing is a matter of calculating your mistakes. The areas are crafted to facilitate this approach. This is what I consider to be the core gameplay loop of Dark Souls as a series. The methodical progression through an area time and time again until you've learned how to navigate each area and slay the boss. You have to work with the meager healing available to you. The challenge is improving player skill to compensate for the lack of healing available. If there were more items or options to heal, it would trivialize much of the challenge. Now, while humanities determine how many times a player can use the Estus Flask, there is also a way to upgrade the flask itself. Throughout the world, the player can find items called Firekeeper Souls. These increase the strength of the Estus Flask's healing. These items are incredibly difficult to find on a first playthrough. There are only 4 found throughout the world. These can be brought to one of the 3 Firekeepers to upgrade the Estus Flask. Each of the 3 Firekeepers will also drop a Firekeeper soul upon death, should the player decide to kill them. However, killing Firekeepers will restrict access to their bonfires. Not only losing an NPC required to upgrade the flask, but also snuffing out 3 of the most important bonfires in the game. This is why most players will wait until the end of a run, then before facing the final boss, slay all of the Firekeepers. That way, when they begin New Game Plus, they'll be able to upgrade their flask as soon as they pass the tutorial. The flask can be upgraded to a maximum of +7. Each time it's upgraded, it will heal a substantially greater amount of health per use, meaning that the Dark Souls 1's maximum healing available is 20 Estus at +7 strength, which will restore 800 HP per use. Dark Souls 1 max Estus is absurdly strong, almost completely refilling a maxed health bar with just 2 swigs. But by the time players have this unlocked, you'll likely be in New Game Plus, where enemies 2-shot you, so it evens out. That concludes the basic ins and outs of the Estus Flask in Dark Souls 1. Before I move on, there's one last subject to cover: alternatives for healing. In the case of Dark Souls games, alternative healing methods essentially dictate how balanced the Estus Flask can be. We've gone over just how carefully balanced the gameplay revolves around the Estus Flask. Throwing in another method of healing can easily tip the scales, as we will see later. In Dark Souls 1, there are only 3 main ways to regain health. Aside from bonfires, of course, but we don't really count those. First is the Estus Flask. Second is humanities. When consumed, the humanity will fully restore a player's health to maximum. This is usually not considered, as humanities are very valuable, as we have covered. Whether to preserve Estus for the boss fight, or as a last resort when your Estus runs out, players do have the option to use a humanity to fully heal. The third option for healing is through miracles, Dark Souls' version of healing spells. These are very helpful, especially early game. They are a very useful benefit the player can utilize to preserve Estus. There's a reason I recommend playing faith builds for first-time playthroughs in every Dark Souls game. They offer the player a safety net for making mistakes. While certain gameplay sections can be made much easier with the use of miracles, I don't feel they break the balance or the challenge of the game as a whole. In order to use miracles, a player must have sufficient points placed into both faith and attunement, points that could have been put into vitality or endurance for more health or stamina. By picking clerics or leveling into a faith build, the player is making a conscious decision to sacrifice points into health for the availability of more heals, which, in my experience, is a more than fair trade to make. Now that concludes the healing of Dark Souls. In my opinion, Dark Souls 1 has the best and most balanced healing system. I appreciate the level of control it leaves in the hands of the player. If I'm confident I can pass through an area with only 5 Estus, then I won't use any humanity. If I'm particularly challenged by an area, I have the safety net of kindling the bonfire or using miracles. The game pushes you to explore in order to gather more humanities for future bonfires. The game incentivizes you to learn routes and manage the limited Estus. The healing system functions more like a product of your surroundings, dependent on the area you're in, rather than an item you steadily upgrade throughout the game. Dark Souls healing is phenomenal. Now let's move on to Dark Souls 2. Next, we will be covering everybody's favorite Dark Souls 2. For this video, I will be using the definitive version, Scholar of the First Sin. Scholar makes this analysis doubly interesting because of the many changes made from Vanilla DS2 affected the viability of the Estus Flask itself. For anyone who doesn't know, Scholar of the First Sin essentially took DS2, randomized most items' locations from where they originally were, doubled the already bloated enemy count in most areas, and added a dozen or more petrified statues to block vital pathways. We will arrive at the effects of those changes shortly. For now, let's focus on the Estus itself. Unlike Dark Souls 1 and 3, the player does not receive the Estus Flask at the very beginning of the game. In both the first and third games, the player receives the Estus Flask while in the tutorial area. It is one of the first things immediately given to the player for them to use and familiarize themselves with. Right after directions on how to walk and attack, players are given their primary mode of healing and shown which button to press for it. In Dark Souls 2, you begin the game, make your character, and are then opened to the tutorial area in Things Betwixt. The player is expected to go through the pathways to learn the ins and outs of Dark Souls combat. The player is not given the Estus Flask in the tutorial. Funnily enough, the player is actually given life gems instead. Not only does the player start with 10 life gems in your inventory before ever receiving the Estus, but in the tutorial section, where it explains press square to heal, the game gives you life gems to teach you the healing mechanics. This shows a fundamental design decision by the devs to introduce healing to the player through life gems rather than the Estus Flask. From the very start of the game, Dark Souls 2 is encouraging players to familiarize themselves with life gems as the primary vehicle for recovering HP. Rather than have the witches give the player the Estus or have it found on a corpse in the tutorial, DS2 has the Emerald Herald give the player their first flask, once the player reaches the hub, Majula. Starting the game off by teaching you to use life gems and then giving you an Estus Flask with one charge as sort of a novelty item. As I have established, I believe the Estus is the fundamental balancing element in Dark Souls games. The challenge of improving your skills until you can complete an area with the limited healing uses available. You get good until those 5 uses can last you from the bonfire through to the boss. By initiating the challenge of the game using a supply of life gems rather than an Estus, the entire mindset for the game is shifted. It would seem to me that the game communicates there will be many ways to heal. The focus is less on improving your skills to make better use of what is available to you. Instead, it seems to be pushing you to use as many safety nets as necessary to get past the unbalanced challenges ahead of you. Now, this is just my personal impression, but it feels like Dark Souls 1 set up a difficult yet fair challenge. Here is a stretch to a boss fight. Improve until you can make it through with only the healing available to you. Dark Souls 2 seems to have set up an unfair challenge. Here are spaces overfilled with enemies. Your sword's durability probably won't last through the area, and there are gank squads waiting for you around every corner. To teach you to deal with this unbalanced challenge, we will shower you with healing items to compensate for the plethora of enemies ahead. Use whatever means necessary to get past this bullshit. I do not believe Dark Souls 2 was designed to be completed with only your Estus. You must rely on other healing methods, unless you've mastered the game already. There is simply no way you were intended to be able to go through these areas with less than a dozen flasks. In the first area, Forest of the Fallen Giants, the initial stretch from the first to the second bonfire is nothing but swarms of hollows. It is inconceivable to me that the designers intended this stretch to be possible for a starting class character with only the 1 to 2 Estus available at this time. Huntsman's Copse is not balanced for the 4 to 5 Estus you'll have by the time you enter the area. I cannot be convinced that they designed Earthen Peak with the idea in mind that a player could pass through it with just their Estus flasks. Now, someone might simply make the get good argument in response to this. However, I think if we are looking at the games as objectively as possible, we can all agree that DS2's enemy placement and quantity were not designed with the same kind of balance as the first game. I believe this is one of the reasons Scholar of the First Sin added so many NPC summons for boss fights. There are dozens of new summonable NPCs found throughout the levels and before fog doors. I think this is the way the developers tried to compensate for the unbalanced enemy numbers and frequency of enemy encounters. This problem is compounded by the functionality of the Dark Souls 2 flask itself. Unlike the first Estus, this one does not heal instantly. Instead, the flask itself functions like a life gem, healing a large portion of health at a slower rate. Having health regenerate slower requires a much larger window for the player to use it effectively. In DS1, you could heal half your health bar instantly. This way you were able to stop, heal, and get right back into the fight before an enemy hit you for standing still for too long. In Dark Souls 2, you often need to run further away to heal, because you need several seconds more to stand there and regain health before jumping back into combat. Otherwise, you frequently run into instances where you take damage and are fending off enemies at low health. Then you stop to heal, but as you are coming out of the healing animation, you take another hit. Often the Estus takes so long to begin restoring health that the enemy is able to overpower the healing and kill you. Dark Souls 2 essentially has much harsher heal punish than Dark Souls 1. A solution to this is to double chug, using 2 Estus flasks for more health and faster recovery. This compensates for the slow regeneration, but the obvious downside is using twice the Estus. Another interesting feature of the Dark Souls 2 flask is the inability to move while drinking. This was also something that occurred in Dark Souls 1. By completely halting your character while healing, it hampers the player in a few ways. Once again, it requires the player to wait until there is a long enough opening in combat in order to heal. If you start healing too early, the boss or enemy can spin around and heal punish you for it. Now, the reason I bring up why stopping to heal is problematic in DS2, and I didn't bring it up in DS1, is because there are no other healing items that allow you to move while using them in Dark Souls 1. However, in DS2, there is a very important item that the player can use while still being able to move their character to avoid attacks or position themselves better for recovery. Let's discuss the infamous life gems. These are a one-time use healing item. The player can collect them throughout the world or purchase them from vendors. Life gems come in several variations, with better versions being found through area progression. They can be purchased indefinitely from the Hag Merchant once the player has defeated the first boss. These items heal a large portion of health at a slower rate, comparable to the miracle replenishment. The player can also move while using life gems, unlike the Estus Flask, which fully halts your character. So you might ask, what's the downside? Well, there lies the problem many people have with life gems. Dark Souls 2's entire world design seems to have been crafted with life gems in mind. The amount of enemies you encounter on the way to a boss fight seems to be dependent on the player having a reserve of life gems. Dark Souls 1's enemy encounters felt handcrafted in each area to allow players a certain number of mistakes while still having enough Estus to face the boss. Dark Souls 2 throws multiple enemies at the player in less maneuverable environments more often. The enemy encounters seem to be designed on the assumption that the player will be taking more damage more frequently. This is exacerbated by the Scholar of the First Sin edition, where they added a few dozen more gank squads to each area. In these cases, life gems are going to be necessary to alleviate some of that tension of saving your Estus for the boss. But when life gems can heal more health at comparable speeds while being able to move and stocked infinitely by an early game vendor, it becomes pretty obvious that balance is an issue here. The life gems simply make the Estus Flask obsolete in most scenarios. This leads to players saving their Estus for a break in the fight, for a big heal between enemy encounters, or even using Estus when they'd rather preserve their life gems. Even some boss fights give me the impression that you are expected to have your Estus and a reserve of healing items. Boss fights like the Skeleton Lords, a fight which spawns dozens of skeletons for the player to manage while taking down the primary enemies. Having around 4 to 5 Estus at this time is not nearly enough to make the long trek to the boss arena and still have Estus for the fight. That is, unless you've mastered the area and can get from the bonfire to the boss room without taking damage. This is possible, I've done it 100 times, but I don't think anyone expects the majority of players to be able to do this, especially not on their first playthrough. Boss fights like Mytha, where the entire boss arena is filled with Dark Souls 2 poison. For any who haven't played DS2, it's essentially on the same health-sapping scale as Scarlet Rot from Elden Ring, or an even stronger version of Toxic from Dark Souls 1. That is, unless the player found the obscure, one-time use mechanic that removes the majority of poison. This fight seems to have been crafted with the knowledge that the players would have a significant quantity of healing items beyond just the basic Estus Flasks. Same goes for the Belfry Gargoyles, which seem to have been designed with the understanding that the player has many more healing items than just the 5 or 6 Estus you might have by the time you reach Belfry Luna. Overall, life gems are a problematic solution to facilitate the changes in game design. The fact is, DS2 needs life gems for the increased area size and enemy placement, as well as compensating for the severely nerfed Estus. The devs designed the Estus to function slower, weaker, and with fewer uses than in DS1. It seems to me that they designed themselves into a corner and decided the only way out was to just break the corner and continue forward. 2 wrongs don't make a right. But 3 wrongs, now that just might. Now enough about life gems, let's move on. As with every Dark Souls game, the player can increase the amount of Estus uses available. Dark Souls 2 would not follow the humanity bonfire mechanics of Dark Souls 1. Instead, it introduced items called Estus Flask shards. Similar to the Firekeeper souls from Dark Souls 1, Estus shards are hidden throughout the map. The player will have to thoroughly explore each area in order to acquire more. These shards can be taken to the Emerald Herald in Majula. She is the only NPC who can take the shards and give the player more uses of Estus. Now, these shards are much easier to locate than the Firekeeper souls from Dark Souls 1. There are more than a few just lying out in the open. However, Scholar of the First Sin edition changed the order and location of many of the shards. 2 are found earlier in the game, but are locked behind the added petrified hollows, meaning they are technically found earlier, but at the cost of a fragrant branch of yore, you won't be getting those till later in the game when you acquire more branches. There are a total of 12 Estus Flask shards to be found in Dark Souls 2. These can be taken to the Emerald Herald for more uses. Interestingly, the Estus Flask maxes out at 12 uses. Since the initial flask given provides 1 charge and the max is 12, this means there is 1 extra Estus shard found in the game. So not only does the Estus heal slower than in DS1, but there are also significantly less uses overall. In addition, there is an extra shard that could bring the Estus to 13 uses, but the game caps it at 12. This just adds to the already confusing choices the devs for Dark Souls 2 made around Estus. Why give players another shard to find, but not allow them to use it? It must have been a safety Estus shard. In case players couldn't locate the 11th shard, here is an extra one to compensate for that. But why not allow players to improve the flask further? Why not allow players to use the extra shard in New Game Plus? I think if the base game maxed out at 12, New Game Plus could have pushed it to 15 or 16 at least. But alas, no such uses for extra shards are available. So there's just a fucking useless shard in the game. That's nice. I cannot find any reasonable explanation for this. The Estus of Dark Souls 2 is already severely downgraded from its predecessor. Did the devs believe that 12 flasks was sufficient for the endgame levels? After beating every DLC, I can tell you I do not believe it is. It seems to me that once again the devs intended life gems to compensate for this. I believe that having higher leveled life gems found throughout the world is evidence. If the only life gems to exist were the base game version sold by the Hag and Majula, that would be one thing. And those base game versions are not weak, they're about as effective as your vanilla flask. But by having scaled life gems of greater strength found through area progression, it is a clear sign that these are intended to be paired with the Estus Flask. In the beginning areas, you'll have 3 Estus and regular life gems. When you enter the Crown of the Sunken King DLC, you'll have 12 Estus and Radiant life gems. There could be ways to balance the difficulty around having Estus and life gems, but I think this is impossible when the player can hold up to 99 life gems of varying tiers at any given time in addition to the reduced Estus Flask strength. We've covered how the player can go about acquiring more uses for the Estus, but what about strengthening it? Once again, there will be items found throughout the world to improve the potency of each swig of Estus. Where Dark Souls 1 had Firekeeper souls, Dark Souls 2 has Sublime Bone Dust. In Dark Souls 1, the max Estus strength was +7. DS2 tops out at +5. The max strength for both Estus Restored is 800 health to the player. On paper, they are of equal strength when maxed out. So, in endgame Dark Souls 2, the player should have 12 uses of a +5 Estus Flask. While it restores the same amount of health as its predecessor, you are capped at 8 fewer uses than in Dark Souls 1. 8 fewer uses in a game with significantly more enemies in less balanced quantities and environments. I cannot help but come to the conclusion that Dark Souls 2's healing mechanics are blatantly inferior to Dark Souls 1. Let's recap briefly. The core gameplay loop of Dark Souls is trudging through an area with limited healing. The limited healing is the basis for motivating you to improve your skills. The enemies are not going to get weaker, and the player will not receive more healing items unless they progress. The only solution is to improve your skills and overcome the challenge. Players get better at the game until that limited healing is enough to make it through an area and slay the boss. In Dark Souls 2, players have access to 12 uses of a +5 Estus. However, the areas are nearly twice the size, with at least twice the enemy count. To compensate for the downgraded Estus, the devs designed infinite healing items. By doing so, they inadvertently threw the already tenuous balance of the game out the window. The game presents you with an unfair challenge of enemies, and gives you an unbalanced mechanic to make up for this. Now before moving on, let's once again look at alternative healing methods. There are, of course, healing spells. The player can spec into Faith or pick the Cleric class at the start. The healing miracles will allow players to preserve their Estus just like in DS1. However, with life gems present, healing miracles are fairly pointless. Why use heal when popping a life gem is just as effective and doesn't require levels to be put into Faith and Attunement and can be done while moving? Humanities have been replaced with human effigies. These do not heal the player when used. They still reverse hollowing without needing to be used at a bonfire. There is plenty of balancing to be discussed in regards to this change. Whereas dying often in DS1 might rob you of your Estus numbers in future areas, dying in DS2 will immediately reduce your health. This is yet another compounding factor of the balance in Dark Souls 2's world. Death is possibly the most punishing in DS2. If a player runs out of human effigies and continues dying, they'll have a very, very difficult time progressing through the game. All the more reason for players to use any means necessary, like life gems, to avoid dying. I believe if several factors were changed in DS2, it could have come out in a much more balanced state. Here are a few personal changes I would have made based on my years of experience with the game. The obvious solution would be to remove life gems and rebalance the Estus. So aside from that, they could have limited the amount of life gems a player can carry to around 3 to 5. Maybe after defeating a boss in the first half of the game, the player could have received a life gem item that allows you to carry 2 to 3 more. Maybe after the Lost Sinner, the player receives, the Sinner's Satchel or something. This item could be equipped to your quick slots to use on the go. The satchel could allow players to carry up to 10 life gems at a time. I would also have removed all life gems above the initial strength. The base life gems are more than potent enough to use from start to finish. Another change would be the availability of life gems. I would not have the hag sell them after defeating the last giant. Maybe after Nishandra had been defeated, she could unlock this. That way the player is able to stock up on extra healing before entering the challenging DLC areas. Having unlimited life gems to purchase after defeating the first boss only hampers the game's balance. If the devs wanted to keep the bloated population of enemies in areas while still maintaining the reduced Estus, there is another clear solution. Return Estus charges back to the player after killing a certain number of enemies without dying. DS3 does this, as we will cover, and it works very well. It motivates the player to keep pushing forward by rewarding your progress with the means to continue. By refilling your Estus as you progress through an area, it would completely alleviate the need for life gems. And finally, I would allow players to increase the Estus past 12 uses. If not in the base game, then in New Game Plus. Allow players to go up to 15 or 20 flasks. And that concludes the healing system in Dark Souls 2. As you may have surmised, I find it inferior to Dark Souls 1 in almost every facet. It seems to just be a series of poor decisions based on a lack of understanding in the core gameplay loop in Dark Souls. Now, Dark Souls 2 was my first Souls game, and I probably have the most hours in it as a result. So there is one thing I'd like to mention before I continue. I have explained the healing system and tried to be as unbiased as possible. It just so happens that DS2 is blatantly unbalanced, and it's impossible to avoid the many flaws and shortcomings of its design when comparing it to its older and younger siblings. I do still enjoy DS2, and I'd ask that players don't throw it out wholesale, regardless of its many issues. Now, moving on to DS3. Dark Souls 3 could have gone several directions with their healing mechanics. They could have continued with the Dark Souls 2 method, slower Estus with less uses, compensated with many alternative healing items. They could have tried to balance this out, or they could have gone back to the Dark Souls 1 method and completely done away with the changes made in Dark Souls 2. What Dark Souls 3 actually ended up doing was a blend of the two. Rather than choose one or the other, they created a hybrid healing system. There's quite a few aspects to cover about the DS3 healing system, so let's begin. Following in the example of Dark Souls 1, DS3 gives the player the Estus Flask in the tutorial area. It is one of the first things immediately shown to the player for you to familiarize yourself with. The Estus Flask of Dark Souls 3 is different from its predecessors in a few ways. Firstly, you're the fastest damn Estus drinker this side of Lordran. Dark Souls 3's Estus is much quicker to use than ever before. Unlike either of the two previous games, you can also move while healing. This makes for very quick healing, while still being able to maneuver your character to avoid being heal punished. All in all, I find this to be a very good change, especially given the increased speed of the enemies in DS3. Being able to maneuver and drink so quickly allows the player to heal at decisive moments between attacks. This is a major improvement over the DS2 flask. You no longer have to run away to heal to ensure you have enough time for the health bar to start filling, keeping a much faster, more balanced flow in boss fights and enemy encounters. The most notable change to the Estus Flask is the introduction, or should I say reintroduction, of the Ashen Estus and focus points. The mana bar existed in Demon Souls, but it was absent in both Dark Souls 1 and 2. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I'll be referring to focus points and the focus point bar simply as mana. Because we've all played video games before, the blue magic juice is just mana with a longer name. Reintroducing a mana bar completely changes the magic system. I'm personally not a fan of the mana bar system and preferred the numbered spell usages. However, this video is covering the healing mechanics of the Estus Flask. Mana is used for casting spells. Instead of having a set number of uses per spell acquired, once the player finds a spell, they can use it indefinitely. Each use will drain mana. In addition, each weapon has been given a special attack. These can be any number of buffs, unique attacks, or special abilities. The player can either use mana for spells or for melee attacks. The mana bar can be restored using Ashen Estus. The quantity of Ashen Estus flasks is controlled by the player. Once you reach Firelink Shrine after the tutorial, the player can speak to Andre the blacksmith. Through this vendor, the player can allot their Estus. The number of flasks can either be allotted towards the Ashen Flask or regular flasks. This gives the player control over how they would like to use their healing and magic. If you're a melee character, you can allot all of your Estus into healing. If you're a magic user, you'll have to find a balance between healing and mana restoration. This is where I have issues with the implementation of the Ashen Estus Flask. I find the Ashen Flask to be a less balanced and less functional way to control the usage of magic in a Dark Souls game. In my opinion, it is biased in favor of melee builds and unfairly restrictive for mage builds. Now again, these will be my personal gripes with the mana system as a predominantly melee-focused player in each Souls game. From what I understand, they tried to create a similar level of balance between the old system and the new, by scaling the mana to a similar level of the spell usages from the first game. For example, if a player in DS1 had 10 attunement, they could hold one use of 20 soul arrows. In Dark Souls 3, if a player has 10 attunement, they should have enough mana to cast Soul Arrow 20 times. So that way it would appear to be an even trade. But the fact is, if we take that same scenario, where a DS1 player has 10 attunement, they can shoot 20 soul arrows. If they have 12 attunement, they could add a soul spear with 4 uses to their arsenal. The player is able to use all 24 spell uses without penalty. Using the soul spear does not impede your ability or quantity of soul arrows. In Dark Souls 3, this is not the case. If a player has 10 attunement, they can equip 1 spell with no limit on the uses except the mana bar. When they equip a second spell, it is not adding more uses. It is giving the option to the player to use a more potent spell at the cost of their weaker spell, because they're both pulling from the same mana bar. I think if they had some sort of scale where the higher your intelligence or faith, the less mana each spell would cost to cast, similar to how Skyrim levels up its magic system, where the higher your skill is, the less it costs to cast lower level spells. That would be the most simple way to even this out, in my opinion. But again, that'll have to be in a video of its own. The main takeaway is this. By requiring Ashen Estus to refill spell usages, they are directly impeding mages' ability to heal. In Dark Souls 1, a player could use every single spell in their arsenal without touching their healing supply. In Dark Souls 3, a player must use their Ashen Estus for more spells, requiring that they sacrifice Healing Estus for their mana. Without dissecting the entire magic system, the point is mages will be spending about half to a third of their Estus uses on the Ashen Estus Flask, and will be stopping to drink Estus more often than melee players. This means that the potency, ease of use, maximum number, and resupply of flasks is doubly important to mages. It also means that early game mages will have a substantially more difficult time traversing the world until they acquire more Estus uses. Magic users will permanently have less ability to heal compared to melee builds, from the start of the game all the way through to New Game Plus. It doesn't matter how high your intelligence or attunement is, even in New Game Plus 5, a mage is still going to be sacrificing their healing Estus in order to cast their spells. There are technically ways around this, like only using the Executioner's Sword or a ring that restores mana after a kill. But for the most part, mages will be needing to drink Estus and rest at bonfires more often than melee players, which completely changes the balance dynamic of the game. Now, let's return to the beginning of DS3. In Dark Souls 3, the player starts with 3 Estus and finds 1 Ashen Estus immediately after beginning the game. After defeating the first boss, the player arrives at Firelink and can allot their Estus, meaning melee players will therefore be starting with 4 Estus. Following in the direction of Dark Souls 2, the areas in this game are much larger than in the first Dark Souls. These are wide open areas with dozens of enemies in the player's path. Having this many enemy encounters requires that the player have a balanced amount of healing available. Dark Souls 2 combated the larger enemy numbers with life gems. Dark Souls 3 thankfully did not include life gems, meaning that your only methods for healing are once again Estus or miracles. Dark Souls 3 would need to find a way to balance the Estus with the larger stretches of combat between bonfires. One way they were able to do this was by refilling the Estus during combat. There is a very neat mechanic in Dark Souls 3 where Estus uses are returned to the player after killing a certain number of enemies. There is a hidden gauge that racks up souls from enemies and restores Estus Flask usages. This is one of my favorite mechanics in any Souls game. By giving the player more healing while they are exploring areas, it incentivizes them to keep going forward. The game rewards you for progressing through the area with the means to continue. This is an excellent way to balance the existing healing mechanics with larger areas without having to rely on unbalanced alternative methods. Another way the devs balanced having larger areas is with more bonfires in Dark Souls 3. Since the devs wanted to keep the Estus as the primary healing method while maintaining these larger, more densely populated areas, they had to compensate by having more bonfires. More bonfires means that the player can rest and restore their Estus usage more frequently. Though, by having so many bonfires, they shot themselves in the foot a bit. The proximity of the bonfires works very well in the early game, but I feel as the game progresses and the player acquires more Estus, these bonfires can create a snowball effect, culminating in players having an overabundance of Estus by the endgame. Ironically, I think it gives melee players a balanced early to mid-game, where mages might struggle. Then, from mid to late game, mages will have a more balanced challenge, while melee players will have more Estus than they necessarily need. So how does a player go about acquiring more uses of their Estus Flask? They followed the example of Dark Souls 2, requiring players locate Estus Flask shards throughout the world. These can be taken to the blacksmith for more uses. The max Estus number available in Dark Souls 3 is 15 uses. It's a nice balance between Dark Souls 1's 20 and Dark Souls 2's 12. A solid 15 uses is more or less balanced depending on whether you use magic. As a predominantly melee player, 15 is a perfect number of Estus, but with the more frequent bonfires and restored flasks, it can result in an overabundance of healing. The player can also increase the potency of the Estus. Just like the two previous games, the player can locate rare items throughout the world to burn at the primary bonfire and strengthen the flask. The player can find a total of 10 undead bone shards throughout the world. Each strengthening of the Estus Flask upgrades the healing rate substantially. Dark Souls 3 also followed DS2 in not requiring humanities for upgrading the Estus. Instead, they serve a purpose similar to DS2's human effigies. The player's max health is not limited by death like in DS2. Rather, Dark Souls 3's version of humanities, called Embers, can be used to buff the player. Embering increases the player's max health substantially until the player dies, and allows them to see and use summon signs. Embers are simply an added benefit players can take advantage of, meaning that DS3 also has the least punishing system for players dying. So, Dark Souls 3 maxes its Estus out at 15 uses plus 10 strength. Max Estus in DS3 heals 600 HP per use. While this is less than the other games, shared 800 HP per use, DS3 also has the most external benefits as we have covered. In addition to the Estus returned and the frequent bonfires, the player can also find a ring that increases the potency of the flask, essentially giving you a plus 11 flask. And for a melee build, 15 plus 11 flasks is an insane amount of healing available. But by the time the player has this level of healing, they'll be entering the DLCs, where enemies and bosses are both substantially stronger. So while they might be steamrolling through the late game, it evens out around the end game. Now before concluding the Estus of Dark Souls 3, let's look at some alternative healing methods. Thankfully, no life gems can be found. The primary methods of healing are once again Estus Flasks and Miracles. They cut down on the alternative healing methods greatly in Dark Souls 3, a change for the better in my opinion. In conclusion, the Dark Souls 3 healing system is substantially more balanced than the DS2 system. They were able to keep and even increase the size of the DS2 maps, having both more areas to explore, but also many more enemies to fight. To compensate for this, the Estus Flask of Dark Souls 3 receives more buffs and ways to utilize it than any Souls game before. They were able to take the elements that worked from DS2 and reintroduce them in a far more balanced way. I still find the Dark Souls 1 system to be the most balanced overall. I think all 3 games in the series would benefit from having the healing system of Dark Souls 1. To be honest, I don't know why they ever changed it. Both Dark Souls 2 and 3 managed to balance out their systems in some way. While Dark Souls 3 does a much better job at this than DS2, neither system functions as straightforward and balanced as the first game. And so, I have created this nifty little graph using prism stones in Dark Souls 1. As you can see, at the start of the graph we have Dark Souls 1's healing system. Then we move to the right. Once we get towards the middle, we arrive at Dark Souls 2's healing system. Well, after whatever that was, we move back up to Dark Souls 3's healing system. I hope you enjoyed this graph. The fixing of the healing system from Dark Souls 2 to 3 was the redemption of the century. But in my opinion, it never got back to that almost perfect system the first Dark Souls had. This has been my retrospective on Dark Souls Healing Redemption. If you disagree, please let me know in the comments. These points are all based on my understanding and experience with the Souls games. However, players of better or worse skill level might come to completely different conclusions. I'm eager to hear how other players would rank these healing systems. And with that,
Be gone with you.